Good morning and peace be upon you wherever you're tuning in from. My name is Qasim Rashid and this is the Qasim Rashid Show here on Sirius XM Urban View Channel 126, the most awesome show in the multiverse. I've got a special show today. It's got some great guests. Congressman Mark Pocan is here to talk about the win in Wisconsin. Human rights lawyer Steve Donziger is here, one of the most prolific human rights lawyers alive today, fighting for climate justice, fighting for justice for Palestine. But what makes this show really special is I'm going to spend a few minutes giving a tribute to my father who passed away on March 28th of this year. And, you know, my mother passed about 2 years ago, and now my father's passed. And it's a strange place to be. It's a really strange place to be. You know, I feel like it's a club that you don't really realize how terrible of a club it is until you're in it. The club of both their parents being gone. One, of course, is bad enough. Two is just, it's one of those things where at this point, I'm now realizing how much trauma so many people have walking around in the world that we don't talk about, that we don't think about, and that unless you've gone through that trauma, you can't really understand. And I just wanted to spend a few minutes today talking about my old man. There's something really indescribable about holding your father's hand as he returns to his maker. You feel his pulse dissipate, his chest rise and fall slower, then slower yet, and you watch really helplessly as he takes his final breath. And that's what my siblings and I experienced on Friday, March 28th at about 10:45 a.m. Chicago time. It's the final Jummah of Ramadan. My father returned to his creator. And on the 30th, on Sunday, March 30th, we held his funeral. And here's what makes me proud. I'm proud of the fact that my father lived a good life. I'm proud of the fact that he died in the comfort of his own home, surrounded by all four of his children. We all held him tightly, counting his every last heartbeat, his every last breath. I can recall the last breath he took. It's etched in my mind, and it will be until I take my last breath. My father died while his 11 beautiful grandchildren were right with him, ranging from 2 to 18 years. He died while his sisters, one, his older sister, his nieces, his nephews, his daughters-in-law sat nearby and prayed for him. He died surrounded by love, prayers, warmth, and with the knowledge that he had completed his life's purpose. He had passed his test, and it was time to return home. The Holy Quran, which is the final holy book for Muslims, it teaches us that ultimately this life is temporary. It is a trial. And that every human being will one day return to the Almighty who created us. The Quran in chapter 2, verse 29, not to get preachy on you guys, but this is personal and I'm being vulnerable and I need to share this. The Quran declares in chapter 2, verse 29, how can you disbelieve in God? When you are without life, He gave you life, and then He will cause you to die, and then He will restore you to life, and then to Him shall you be made to return. And then the Quran goes on to teach us this prayer in Arabic, to recite when someone dies. The Arabic is Inna lillahi wa inna ilaihi rajiun, which translates roughly to the following: to God we belong, and to God must we return. Now, I can't possibly do justice to my father's prolific life in just a few short minutes. I'm not going to try. I will write a book about this eventually. But I just want to share a few anecdotes of who he was and exemplify what he stood for, and the legacy that he leaves behind. This is my father, Maulana Abdur Rashid Yahya. He was a servant, a scholar, leader, an author, an orator, an imam, a linguist, a professor, a judge, a world traveler, a health enthusiast, a fashion aficionado, a husband, a father of 4, grandfather to 11. That was my father, Maulana Abdur Rashid Yahya. He was born June 19, 1950, as the 8th of 9 children in a small village known as Muradwal in the Punjab region of Pakistan. He was actually born during the holy month of Ramadan as well, on the 3rd day. And I think it's prolific and prophetic that he died on the 3rd to last day of Ramadan. His father, my grandfather, Miyas Rajuddin, was a school principal and a scholar. He spent 15 years studying faith before deciding that he would accept Islam and in particular join the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. More on that later. Now, Muradwal 1950 was not much different than Muradwal in 2025. I visited just a few months ago. And while a few homes now have electricity, this village has no paved roads, no plumbing infrastructure, no real revenue aside from minor farming and agriculture. And so the question is, how did an infant born to a rural middle-class family in the agricultural regions of Pakistan, a nation then only 3 years old, live a life that took him around the world? And I mean around the world, from Pakistan to the United States, the United Kingdom to the UAE, South Korea to South Africa, Guatemala to Germany, Lesotho to Botswana, Mecca to Medina, Rabwa to Qadian, New York to North York, Hamilton to Harrisburg, Mozambique to Manchester, Southfields, London to the south side of Chicago. And the list yet continues. You see, my grandfather raised my father with the intention of dedicating his son's life as a servant of humanity. And so after completing his high school and his bachelor's, my dad gained admission to the Jamia Ahmadiyya Seminary in Rabwa, Pakistan. This is a 7-year Islamic seminary where during this time, he would first complete it in 6 years and graduate at the top of his class in 1975. But he would gain a scholarly command of Arabic, of Urdu, of English, a deep knowledge of Persian and Farsi. And then a year later, after graduation, he and my late mother, Tahira Rashid, would be wed in April of 1976. In fact, this April would have been their 49-year anniversary. They welcomed their first child, my elder brother, a year later. And then my grandfather died just 13 days after my older brother was born. My dad at the time was only 26. And my dad was of that generation that he was rarely emotional. But even into the final years of his life, when he would speak of his own father, his eyes would well up with tears because he missed him so dearly. And so despite the pain I feel right now losing him, I take comfort in knowing that nearly half a century later, my father is reunited with his own father. But in those 13 days, something else significant happened. Before my grandfather died, then third caliph of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community appointed my father to travel to the United States of America as an imam, as an Islamic scholar. And so my grandfather died knowing his youngest son would carry on his legacy of scholarship and service to humanity on a global scale. And so my father, patiently bore the loss of his father and then remained committed to his mission. He entrusted my mother and his firstborn to his family and, of course, to the Almighty. And with that, he departed to Pakistan in 1977. And he spent the next 4 years alone. And when we were kids, he would tell us that how even calling my mother from the United States to Pakistan required scheduling a long-distance phone call a week in advance. And it cost roughly $5 a minute to call, which in today's terms, by the way, is $26 a minute. Like the calls that we make for free were $26 a minute back then. I cannot imagine the level of sacrifice and patience and commitment that he imbibed to relentlessly continue his work. Separated by oceans, separated by continents from his wife and child and his mother and his siblings, it was this ardent dedication to education, to service, and to fulfilling his promise to his own father that carried my father through his next nearly 50 years of service before he was called back to his maker. He stood for scholarship. He stood for justice. And while he was an Islamic scholar and professor who taught doctorate and postdoctorate level classes on Quranic hermeneutics, on Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi, and Hanbali, and Jafari jurisprudence, these are different schools of thought, of split work Arabic translation of the Quran. I mean, by all standards, he was one of the premier global scholars on the Quran and on Islam. But despite that, my siblings and I were never indoctrinated with any form of religious compulsion. While he was resolute on praying 5 times a day, my siblings and I were never forced to pray. And though he generously donated more than 10% of his meager income to charity, we were never forced to donate our incomes. And I put an asterisk on never, I'll explain in a second. But he was adamant that we do our own self-discovery of faith. Yes, he encouraged me to study the Holy Quran and books like the Philosophy of the Teachings of Islam. But just as adamantly, he encouraged me to study other religions, attend other services, and read books by other scholars and writers of different faiths and no faith. So my father, Maulana Abdur Rashid Yahya, the Islamic scholar, is why I took the time to read books by Christian apologists like Lee Strobel and Paul E. Miller and Dr. Philip Jenkins. Why I took the time to read books by new atheists, vehemently Islamophobic, and I would even say bigoted writers like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris. Why I read a variety of Orthodox Muslim scholars and Jewish scholars. Why I visited Hindu temples and Jewish synagogues and Buddhist temples, Sikh Gurdwaras. It's why I've read the Gospels cover to cover numerous times. Why I've read the Torah, the Vedas, the Kitab al-Aqdas, the Book of Mormon. Because my father understood that faith is personal between me and God. That the Quranic commandment, there shall be no compulsion in religion, was not a suggestion, but a sacred protection to be honored for all people of all faiths or no faith. And he believed, as I now do too, that when I stand before the Almighty, I will be asked about the choices I made and why I chose to believe what I believe. And giving the answer of, because my dad told me to, is not going to be a good answer. And so perhaps the greatest gift my father ever gave me was that rather than teach me what to think blindly, he pushed me to learn how to think critically. He would always say that your grandfather studied faith for 15 years before accepting Islam and joining the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. How could I possibly, with that living example in front of me, force faith on any of my children? Now, on service to humanity, however, none of the above applied. There was no option of serving humanity. That was an order. As ferociously as he protected us from religious indoctrination, he unrelentingly infused in us the need to serve all humanity, regardless of faith or color or creed. He would tell us, I don't care who the person is, what they follow or don't follow, or where they're from, or even if they mistreat you, never miss the opportunity to serve humanity. And you should be so focused on serving all humanity that your only question should be, did I fulfill my obligation to my neighbor in need? That was his response to every complaint we made. And as kids complain when you ask us to do work, when it was time to do a food drive or raise funds for the less fortunate, including out of our own pockets or cleaning up trash on the side of a busy highway, when I would complain, he would say, are you complaining because you think you've served humanity enough? Or do you think it's probably a better idea to shut up and get back to work? And he was blunt about it, but he was right. Because when it comes to service to humanity, there is no complaining. It's let's get to work. Let's get to work and let's get this done because people need us to be there for them. Not because of any other reason than the human dignity that every person has. And so when it came to charity, my dad never forced us to donate to charity, but he incessantly reminded us that this is in fact trust in God, that he would increase our incomes if we donated to the less fortunate. And it was a matter of service to humanity, as direct financial donations is how most practically you help the less fortunate. So this is who he was. This is what he stood for. He leaves behind a legacy of people committed to service to humanity, of people committed to worshiping the unity of God and focusing on the unity of humanity by serving humanity. He had a great sense of humor, always ready to laugh, always ready to roast me as his son, and loved to be roasted, because this is just who he was. For him, smiling was charity. This is a famous saying of the Holy Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that a smile is charity. And that's what he focused on. Even in his final moments, he trusted in God, trusted in the Almighty. In the religion of Islam, the azan, the call to prayer, is recited in your ear when you're born, but there's no prayer offered. And likewise, when you die, there's a funeral prayer, but there's no call to prayer for that prayer. So from that perspective, the call to prayer at your birth is for the prayer at your death. And when the actual call to prayer is made for one of our daily prayers, we know the prayer is just a few minutes away. And that's the perspective that we should have, that our life, in the grand scheme of things, is just a blink of an eye. It's a constant reminder for us that life is too short to worry about petty things, or worse, to harm others. It's a reminder that instead we should spend our short time here in service to one another, elevating one another, being relentless in that service. That's the legacy my father leaves behind. And the literally tens of thousands of people, not an exaggeration, who have sent calls and texts and tweets and emails and DMs and comments. It's been overwhelming, and I'm so grateful to you for all of it. I will miss my dad more than I can express in words, but I tell you, I take joy in knowing he lived a wonderful, blessed life dedicated to just serving those around him. That's all he cared to do. That's all that made him happy. And he lived a life doing what he loved. And I can't be sad about that. I can be sad about him being gone, but I cannot be sad about the wonderful life that he lived. In fact, it gives me joy and it gives me inspiration to continue to do what I can to make sure that I can live up to his standard and fill his shoes. All right, guys, thank you for giving me a few minutes to share that with you. And I'll be sure to share more in the future. When we come back from break, we are going to welcome Congressman Mark Pocan, and somebody who I've long followed. He is a true fighter for working people. We'll talk about Wisconsin and what Democratic Party leadership needs to do to actually listen to its base. You're listening to the Qasim Rashid Show here on Sirius XM Urban View Channel 126. We'll be right back after the break. Welcome back. I'm excited to welcome Congressman Mark Pocan. I'm here with Congressman Mark Pocan, someone who I've admired for a long time for a very simple reason that he's a principled leader. He does what he says he's going to do, and he's reliable on issues of human rights and justice. Congressman, we're right now celebrating the win in Wisconsin of Judge Crawford, a state that Trump won by a point. Judge Crawford flipped it by an astounding 11 points and won by double digits. This wasn't just a win, but it was a major message, in my view, that we're not going down without a fight. What do you see as a 2 or 3 actions that Wisconsin Democrats took that made this win so emphatic, even as they faced a maniac billionaire with unlimited funds?
Well, I think the most important part that doesn't get talked about is it's not just that we had a big win, and that is important because the court will be a more fair court, and Elon Musk didn't buy a justice, and all those are good reasons why people came out. But it really was people are so upset with the Trump-Musk agenda that they came out at a volume of people that we did not expect.
Yeah.
Back in 2023, when Janet Protasewicz flipped the court from a conservative majority to a liberal majority, we thought that was the high weather turnout level. And it turned out, we turned out even more people, almost at midterm congressional election levels for an April nonpartisan race. And that's because people felt like they're not heard.
Yeah.
Republicans aren't having town halls, so you don't have a chance to express your concerns. And what they did have was this election. So they came out, they had their voices heard, they delivered a resounding victory. But really, I think it shows just how far off the Republicans are with their agenda.
They're very detached, and that much is clear. And I'm glad to see people waking up to that. Who do you credit for this win? Judge Crawford is obviously a fantastic public servant. She knows her stuff. But, as I say, no person is an island. What made the team around her so effective to make this win possible? What lessons should the broader Democratic Party take from this win to duplicate it elsewhere?
Well, our Democratic Party is an extraordinary party in Wisconsin. Ben Wickler is a very strong party chair. If we had a Wisdems and a Ben Wickler in every state, we wouldn't be where we're at now.
That's
right?
true.
And part of that is because we don't just wait for elections. We communicate with people even when there's not elections. People are knocking on doors. They're connecting with people so that you're not just asking for something at election time. You already have an established relationship with folks. You have campaign offices and even very small towns because you want to always be a part of that community and part of that presence. It's just being connected. And I think the Democratic Party has done a really good job of that. So they're really good at getting out the vote. And then I think we recruit strong candidates. We're making sure that we're ready for these elections. But, I have to probably credit Wisdems in a very big way because it's their organization that has enabled us to really have a tool to get out the vote in the way it was. And then clearly, people are just so upset with the current agenda. This was seen as their way to be able to communicate that.
We're speaking with Congressman Mark Pocan of Wisconsin, and I co-sign your praise for Ben Wickler. This is a man who absolutely has led by example. He was my vote for DNC chair, but we can't always get what we want, although he's doing a phenomenal job in Wisconsin. And this kind of segues into the final part of the questions I wanted to ask you, Congressman. You're a progressive. You've been on the right side of history on so many important issues, whether it's condemning the genocide in Gaza, whether it's demanding universal health care, fighting unapologetically for judicial reform. You're leading from the front. And even now, though, we see that the majority of Americans across the political spectrum support these positions that you hold. And this is one thing that, especially when I talk to my conservative friends, we talk about these issues of universal health care or a living wage, and they're on board with these things. Here's the question, and this is a sticky question, but I think you're the man to answer it. What can Democratic voters do to demand that our centrist party leadership actually listen to the Democratic base rather than trying to continue to appeal to the right? Sometimes we feel like that's what's happening, whether it's, rather than focus on public safety, let's just throw more money at police. Rather than focus on protecting LGBTQ rights, let's throw trans people under the bus. It just doesn't make sense to me why we're getting this from party leadership. How can we make your voice that's so effective and reflective of the American public, how can Democratic voters get party leadership to recognize that this is actually where the majority of Americans are?
Well, I used to have a bumper sticker for my campaign that said, if the people lead, eventually the leaders will follow. And, the people are in a different place often than Democratic elected officials. And I think the biggest reason is, the special interest in Washington. There's 15,000 lobbyists in Washington, D.C., 10% alone just for big pharma. And you wonder why we pay more for prescription drugs than anywhere else in the world, right?
Yeah.
I think it's that, knowing that if we fight for the people, which is what they're really asking of us right now, and we are connected to the people, and we do that by doing things like town halls, then you're doing your job. And, if you're worried about fundraising and therefore you have to talk to special interests and all those sorts of things, you're not doing the job as well. So, people just have to, I think, make sure that we're holding elected officials accountable to them first and foremost. That's why, I love to push the idea of town halls, especially.
Yes.
Republicans right now are afraid to do them. Let's go to Republican districts and do them and show people we're fighting for them. The more we are connected to the people in our districts who, as you said, all these issues have popular support, and don't get connected to a bunch of special interests in Washington, D.C., the better off we are. And, I think because of campaign finance, it's an issue that we all have to take as a priority issue, because until you really stop big money's influence, you're going to have people still thinking they have to go appeal to special interests rather than the people that elected them.
Congressman, I'm so grateful to have your time today. Last quick question before you go, and this is a question I get a lot. I'd love for them to hear directly from you, one of our esteemed elected officials. What gives you hope in these really difficult times? What keeps you fighting? What keeps you going?
Honestly, the people in my district, I've been knocking on doors because of the Supreme Court race, talking to people. I've been doing town halls so that I'm staying connected. People are way smarter than Republicans think they are, and they're following stuff and they're watching it and they're hopeful. So even though right now people are nervous about what Donald Trump is bringing, we're having victories in the courts, the rule of law. Even Trump-appointed judges are ruling against Donald Trump. So we just have to stick together, respect each other, fight for each other. And as long as we're doing that, we are the majority, period. We're doing what's right. And doing what's right is always going to be the best path forward. So I think, I get so much energy and power from my constituents, from when I talk to people back home who are also, who just care about these issues. As long as we're all doing this together, it is, one solid movement across the country, both inside and outside Washington. We're having progress, we're winning, and even in these tougher times where elections do have consequences, we're having those victories, and we just have to make sure that we continue to fight for more.
Congressman Mark Pocan, Wisconsin 2nd District, thank you so much for giving us a few minutes. Thank you for continuing to fight for these values in the halls of Congress, and we hope to have you back on soon.
Yeah, thank you so much. Anytime, be glad to.
All right, take care. That was Congressman Mark Pocan. When we come back from break, we are going to welcome Steve Donziger, who is a brilliant human rights leader who has been fighting for climate justice or Palestinian justice for a long, long time, and I'm excited to bring him on. Welcome back. You're listening to the Qasim Rashid Show here on Sirius XM Urban View Channel 126, the most awesome show in the multiverse. I'm extraordinarily excited about our guest today, Stephen Donziger, and if I mispronounce that, he will correct me. He's a human rights lawyer. He's one of the world's leading voices on climate justice and has the scars to prove it. You've certainly heard of his case. He won a $9.5 billion settlement against Chevron, which was robbed of him due to what I will flat out call judicial corruption, corporate corruption, political corruption. And he has been one of the most steadfast, courageous, consistent voices, a fighter for human rights over the last 2 decades plus. Stephen, thank you so much for being with us today.
I'm really happy to be with you, and thank you so much for inviting me.
I was a young law student or a young lawyer when I first began to hear about your work, and it's been inspiring for a number of reasons. One, because we know how corrupt the fossil fuel industry is. We know that they've known since the 1970s that the work they're doing to extract and exploit fossil fuels will decimate our climate, decimate indigenous communities, decimate Black and brown communities. Yet they did it anyway, and they lied, and they made record profits. And you've been one of the bright spots over the last 50 years who's held these corporations accountable. I'd love to know more about kind of what's your origin story, what's your superhero origin story that made you say, this is where I'm going to dedicate my life, despite the massive obstacles I'm going to face?
Well, that's a great question. Thank you. I mean, I'm from Jacksonville, Florida, Northeast Florida. I grew up in a Jewish pro-Zionist household. Um, my mom, there's a strain of Judaism that's very sort of tied into civic connection and trying to help others. And that was like my mom to a max. Like we would go
Mm.
to protests when I was a kid for, boycotts of the local grocery store chain because of, the farm workers union, et cetera. So like my mom cultivated in me, I think, a sensitivity for others. And as I've grown older, I've sort of I became a lawyer largely to use whatever legal talents I could develop to try to help others make the world a better place, probably not unlike you. So, it just so happened that my work manifested in this case that grew into this enormous, probably the leading human rights environmental case in the world. We won the largest legal judgment ever on behalf of indigenous peoples against an oil company out of Ecuador against Chevron, back in 2013 for over $10 billion. And then they attacked me with a slap lawsuit. They sued me for 60 billion. I got sued for the most amount of money of anyone in U.S. history, if you can believe that. And ultimately, that led to my 3-year detention at home and in prison on a really manufactured criminal contempt of court case. You mentioned like there was a lot of corruption. Well, this is an example of that, where Chevron convinced the judge to appoint their law firm to privately prosecute me in a criminal contempt case. I'm the only person in U.S. history ever to be prosecuted by a corporation, which is why I was calling myself a corporate political prisoner.
Right.
And, look, I'm a man of relative privilege. I went to Harvard Law School, upper middle class background. And they went after me because of the work I did representing indigenous peoples in the Amazon of Ecuador, representing them successfully. We won this case. It got affirmed by Ecuador Supreme Court. It's still enforceable. They refused to pay, and they thought, Chevron, that is, they thought the best way
Yeah.
not to pay me was to sue me and try to intimidate me into leaving the case. And I have not. I've gotten through it. The case is still viable. But what I went through is extraordinary. And it's really, I would say, an incredible master class in how corporations can weaponize the law and
Right.
manipulate our judicial system to try to target people who
Mhm.
try to hold them accountable, me being an example. And of course, that led to a whole other host of advocacy work about on the Palestinian issue.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
mentioned at the top, I grew up in a Zionist household. After October 7th, I really dug in and tried to get myself a little more educated about the issue. And now I'm a proud anti-Zionist, and I'm furious at what's being done in the name of Jewish safety to commit, what most legal experts consider to be a genocide against
Absolutely.
the Palestinian people. So, I've gotten into other issues, and and obviously the country faces enormous challenges right now. I mean, my
Yeah.
situation is just one manifestation of that, but, I'm
Well, I
proud
want to
that,
I want to dive
yeah,
into that. I think the
yeah.
point you make, Stephen, is astute, that there's so much intersectionality between these issues. You can't talk about climate justice without talking about economic justice. You can't talk about climate justice without talking about racial justice. And what we're seeing, the data is very clear about this, right? There's a reason why Black and Latino Americans are 35% more likely to live nearby a toxic waste plant. It's because Black and Latino Americans don't have the representation that white Americans have. And so when they're building these plants, they'll say, well, let's just throw them on, in an area that's predominantly Black, or let's throw them on an area that's predominantly indigenous. Right? Folks forget that the Dakota Access Pipeline initially was supposed to go through a wealthy, upper middle class white community. And they were like, oh, hell no. We're going to call our elected and say, we don't want it over here. So they said, sure, let's just throw it through, sacred indigenous land, because God knows they don't have any power and we can demonize them as we have for centuries in this country. Um, the way we tell a story makes a big difference. And so eventually we'll need to talk about making your life story into a movie similar to Aaron Brockovich, because I think a lot of folks need to understand that this is not Hollywood. This is real life, and it's affecting them on a daily basis. I want to commend you because I'm learning now in this interview that you grew up in a Zionist household and that post October 7th, you took the time to reflect and understand that October 7th doesn't happen as a provocation, it happens as a reaction. And I'd love for you to talk about your journey to kind of understanding that, because that's a pretty big shift. You're not 100 years old, but you're not a spring chicken either. And so for you at a stage in your life where you're already established, you're a grown, intelligent, thoughtful person, to take such a core identity and say, hey, let me reevaluate this, that speaks to your courage and your integrity. Talk about that journey. What was that like?
Well, thank you. Extraordinary journey. And I'm glad I faced this issue and took it on. I mean, I was living in a fog on this issue for years, and also I was in survival mode because of Chevron's attacks on me
Yeah,
for 10 years. Like
yeah,
I couldn't do anything except every day wake up and try to get through that. So I didn't
yeah,
even have the bandwidth to sort of think about much else. And when October 7th, I mean, one of my pet peeves is like it takes a lot of work in the United States to decontaminate your head, decolonize your
mm,
head, and get actual accurate information about
yeah,
injustice because
yeah,
the media is not reporting this for the most part. And when they do, it's often distorted
mm,
or, through half measures. So in any event, I had avoided the issue of Israel and Palestine for years, partly on purpose because I think I didn't want to deal with it because so many of my family members and people who donated to the Chevron case and supported it were Zionist.
sure.
And I just, but this is the kind of interesting part. So when October 7th happened, the next day, October 8th, I was sitting with my son who was a senior in high school, and he's like, "Dad, are you going to post?" I'm on Instagram a lot. He goes, "Are you going to post about what happened?" I said, "I don't know if I'm going to post about that. I'm sort of trying to stay away from that issue." And he said, "No, Dad." He's like,
Wow.
"You got to post." He goes, "Like you post about human rights issues all over the place. How do you not post about this? People want to know what you think." So I
Wow.
did a post that day. And remember, this was one day after the
Yeah,
October
fresh.
7th event. I mean, no one had any idea that there would be like a full-blown genocide. Okay.
Yeah,
Like this is the very beginning. And I'm like, okay, I see where this is heading. I knew Israel with Netanyahu in charge was going to go all out.
yeah, yeah,
So I basically did a post about the Amnesty International report that explained that Israel is actually not a democracy, but an apartheid state.
yeah.
And I said, whatever's going to happen, understand that the country doing this is not a legit country, and it has laws that discriminate against non-Jews. So I put up that post. It got a huge response, and I just haven't stopped since. And
Wow.
I keep I mean, not as much lately, and I really need to get a little more back in the issue, particularly what's happening this week. But I just want
Yeah,
to
of
mention that shortly after I did that post, I read a book by Rashid Khalidi called "The Hundred Years' War in Palestine."
course. Yeah,
For those who don't know him, he's a professor. He just retired actually at Columbia.
yep.
Um, Brilliant historian. The book is absolutely brilliant. It blew me away, like the level of detail and footnoted historical knowledge that had been denied me as a Jew, or really as a maybe even just any American. We're not getting this
Being.
information as
Yeah,
part of our normal education. And it just opened me up to the whole story. And now I understand the story. And it's infuriating on two levels. One is like it's just awful,
yeah.
awful what's happening to the
Of
Palestinian people. Obviously, it was awful what happened to the Jewish people during World War II, and there's
course. No doubt.
all of this is awful. But for this to happen at this stage is sickening to me. For it to be done by Jews in the name of Jewish safety is just awful. It makes it even more awful. And I was also left with this just bad feeling that I have been deceived my whole life by those around me, by my rabbis, by my synagogue, by my family, by my friends. I mean, everyone had like bought into this notion that the world's against us. We need to fight, do whatever we can to survive, even if it means oppressing other people. And not having had access to this. I'm not blaming anyone. I should have read this
No,
book decades
I
ago, but it just blew my mind, and I now finally feel liberated and clear about the issue.
if you're just tuning in or speaking with Stephen Dunziger, a human rights lawyer, national, global climate justice advocate, we're talking about his journey from Zionism to anti-Zionism and his work to uphold Palestinian justice. And what you're describing, Stephen, is what I've heard from many of my Jewish friends, particularly those who are engaged with Jewish Voices for Peace, if not now. Rabbis that I've known for many years who describe their own journey in this space as well. And I think it's a
Yeah.
huge journey, right? Malcolm X says beautifully that don't condemn somebody just because they don't know what you know. There was a time when you didn't know what you know now. And our job is to facilitate that development and growth of every human being. And that's why my door always remains open, even if when I face someone who's staunchly pro-Zionist and staunchly in support of the siege on Gaza, my conversation with them is to understand where they're coming from. And I don't think that's easy. It's not. It's extraordinarily frustrating at times. But my view is if we shut that door, we stifle our own progress. So I commend you, and actually I commend your son for being a senior in high school and being so thoughtful to push you. It's great when our kids push us to be better. Mine
Oh
just
yeah.
it's a good feeling. It's like I did something right as a parent that my kid is pushing me. I want to shift gears in these last 10, 12 minutes we have and talk about we'll talk a bit more about Mahmoud Khalil in a minute, but you've been working on this slap case against Greenpeace. Talk about that because I don't think it's gotten very much media attention. Unsurprisingly, corporate media is hiding this pretty aggressively. What's going on and how can folks get involved?
All right. So, um, this is a crazy part of the journey, my journey, and a crazy thing that's happening in the world that's not getting enough attention because of all the other even worse crazy stuff happening.
Yeah.
But essentially, if people remember the Standing Rock protests in North Dakota in 2016, where the Standing Rock Sioux tribe and literally hundreds of indigenous groups from around the country and world came to North Dakota along with their supporters, allies, and they camped out in Standing Rock Sioux land to try to block construction of an oil pipeline by the Energy Transfer Pipeline Company. And there were all sorts of conflicts. This went on for months and months. The pipeline company hired private security that violently used dogs to attack protesters, and on and on. Ultimately, winter came and the protests sort of dissipated, and the pipeline ended up opening in 2017. The company's chairman is a man who's named Kelsey Warren, who is an extreme right-wing ideologue who has donated millions to Donald Trump's campaigns. And Kelsey wanted to get back at the protesters, and he did this by targeting Greenpeace, even though Greenpeace had virtually no role in these protests. They had like 6 people on the ground when the protests were led by the Standing Rock Sioux,
Wow.
and they were largely peaceful protests. And he sued Greenpeace, really using the same legal theory that Chevron used against me for
Wow.
representing the Ecuadorian indigenous people in Ecuador, and in that successful $10 billion lawsuit. And the legal theory was based on the civil RICO statute, the racketeering statute passed by Congress to target the mafia. And Kelsey Warren was trying to claim Greenpeace was essentially a mafia organization. Remember, this is literally the group that birthed the modern environmental movement in the United States in the 1970s. They've done spectacularly successful work for decades, okay? And they have, you know, chapters in 25 countries. They're probably the world's leading environmental
Yeah.
organization, okay?
Right.
And he chose them because he wanted to send a message. It wasn't, again, it's a slap lawsuit. It's not a legitimate lawsuit. It's really using the law to try to silence advocacy.
Yeah.
And he hit Greenpeace with hundreds of millions of dollars of supposed damages. I was watching the trial for days. I'm part of this trial monitoring team. The case is literally, from an evidentiary perspective, a nothing burger. It's nothing there. It's all like this made up defamation. They claim Greenpeace lied when they claimed the pipeline traversed indigenous territory. They claim it didn't because it wasn't actually in the reservation. It was outside the reservation, but it's traditional ancestral lands, so Greenpeace didn't lie. But what happened was they filed the lawsuit. By the way, same law firm that Chevron used against me, same
Wow.
theory, same
Yep.
playbook. Okay. They filed the lawsuit in a isolated rural county where the protest took place. The county in North Dakota only has 30,000 people. 75% voted for Trump. It's like a white Christian nationalist county. Most people work on the refinery or have ties to the fossil fuel industry. And they filed it there because they knew Greenpeace could not get a fair trial. And I was watching like the jury, which had no Native American, no person of color on the entire jury.
Wow.
The jurors were openly admitting during voir dire that they couldn't be fair, and the judge was seating them anyway. This was not a trial, as that word is commonly understood. This was
Kangaroo court.
it was a choreographed show
Yep.
that was completely unfair to Greenpeace. The result, which came yesterday, did not surprise me. Greenpeace lost, and they imposed $660 million of what I would call phantom damages against Greenpeace. Now, the good news is that we were there, that is 9 prominent lawyers. We documented every due process violation. We are going to produce a report to the world about what happened. Greenpeace is going to appeal this, obviously, to a higher court in North Dakota. And I think ultimately Greenpeace will prevail. But you can't deny that these slap lawsuits designed to weaponize the law against mostly progressive activists are effective in the sense that Greenpeace has spent years, who knows how much money, massive staff time dealing with these legal attacks by
Sure.
this Trump ally, Kelsey Warren, who
Sure.
himself is a billionaire who's worth about $7 billion personally. So
Yeah.
he's basically financing a case against Greenpeace. And Greenpeace is really a stand in to me for the Standing Rock Sioux, who he hates the indigenous people. They're a
Yeah.
stand-in for the entire damn climate movement, and
Yeah.
they're a stand-in for the right to protest. So I'm telling people, rally behind. No matter what you think of Greenpeace, they got to be defended because there's way too much at stake
It's that
through
element of
this
due
one
process.
case.
Yeah, it's that element of due process. It's to intimidate others into silence as well. If they can go after Greenpeace, they can go after your local, city council protest. They can go after your local school board protest and send that message. And this is how we transform from a democratic republic into an oligarchy or a kakistocracy of just the worst and most incompetent people leading. Stephen, we're down to our last couple of minutes. I wanted to ask you about Mahmoud Khalil, a grotesque violation of due process once more. The idea that a documented green card holder, a legal resident, married to a US citizen, wife 8 months pregnant, that ICE agents, not in uniform, just in ordinary civilian clothing, can show up without a warrant, without a judicially signed decree, without any evidence, and simply lock him up and take him away to an undisclosed location, deny him due process, deny him access to counsel, deny even telling them where he is. This is something you would expect out of a dictatorship, but now it's being defended by not just Trump, he's a fascist, but by Marco Rubio, by Secretary of State, by the entire right. Um, what does this mean? I mean, how should Americans take this? What is the warning that we need to understand from this situation?
So I want to sort of frame it this way. When I was a young journalist before I became a lawyer, I lived in Central America and I covered the civil war in El Salvador. And people were literally being disappeared and murdered by government security forces and private militias on behalf of right-wing oligarchs in El Salvador. This was a constant feature of that society at that time.
Yeah.
People need to understand that there are people right now being disappeared off the streets in the United States of America, disappeared, abducted by government forces, and put in places where you don't know where they are. This happened to Mahmoud at least for 2 days, and he's still, I consider him abducted right
Absolutely.
now. He's still being detained. It's happening to immigrants on the streets of America. It
Right.
happened with this so-called deportation of Venezuelan gang members, which was a whole lot of BS for the most part, to this crazy, torture detention center in
Yeah.
El Salvador that
Concentration
has a
camp.
history of torture.
Yeah.
So we're seeing this right now. I want to tell people these are not just normal arrests. These are forced disappearances without due process of law, designed to get people out of this country without any legal hearing.
Yeah.
Trump doesn't care whether someone's a gang member or just in his mind he can describe as a gang member because it's all a big PR stunt that
Yep.
he's using at the expense of human dignity and human life and the law to try to make himself look good to his base. It's disgusting. And Mahmoud, who's someone I had the privilege and honor of getting to know. I mean, this was a crazy story, but just real quick, I went up to
Yeah.
Columbia to teach a class or to lecture at a class about my story about Ecuador, what happened to me. And in that class were some Palestinian students, and they asked me to help, not advise them as a lawyer. I wasn't representing them, but just to help support them
Insight. Sure.
as they were dealing with the administration over there over the issue of the encampment, divestments from endowment, divestments from Israel, et cetera, et cetera. So I got to know him pretty well. Met with him probably a half dozen times over a period of several months. And I've never met a more humble, kind, sensitive, respectful young leader as Mahmoud Khalil. It is
Wow.
disgusting the way the Trump administration is trying to portray him as a terrorist. It is disgusting. It is false. I reject it wholeheartedly. I knew him personally. He's being used and his life is potentially really being impacted negatively because of the way the White House is talking about him, the way Marco Rubio is talking about him. He's being used as a guinea pig for this complete violation of human rights that is now starting to happen on a much grander scale, where students all over the place who support the Palestinian cause peacefully, lawfully, in conformity with our Constitution, are being arrested by ICE agents, locked up, with the idea that they would be deported. And I just want to say another thing.
Please.
He needs to be released right now.
Immediately.
Okay?
Yeah.
There is no reason for him to be in detention as his legal proceedings play out. His arrest was clearly unconstitutional. It's highly likely he's going to win this case. There's no reason he has to be detained, but Chevron did the same thing to me. I want to say this.
Yeah.
I spent 2 years and 2 months, if you can believe this, locked up in this apartment, unable to leave, with a GPS ankle bracelet on,
Horrific.
waiting for a misdemeanor trial where the maximum sentence I could receive, the trial was bogus, 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 but let's just say it was legit. The max sentence I could receive was 6 months in prison, and I spent over 4 times that waiting for my trial. My point is, they know the process can be the punishment. They know that they want to
Yeah.
keep him detained for as long as possible before a court really hears his case, which will result very likely in his release. But in the meantime, they're using the process to punish him. It's unfair. In my opinion, he needs to be released immediately.
Stephen, thank you for your clarity, for your foresight. You speak as a human rights lawyer, you speak as a Jewish American, you speak as somebody who recognizes the humanity of all people, and God love you for that. We'd love to have you back on soon. In the meantime,
Anytime, brother, and thank you for what you do. We're going to collaborate, and you
absolutely.
know, let me know when you get this out, and I'll help you
Absolutely.
amplify it.
Well, let me, before you go, last thing I'll ask you to do is share with our listeners how they can follow you and how they can support your work.
Yeah, thank you. You can follow me on Instagram. It's my handle, Steven Donziger, Donziger. I have a website called freedonziger.com. By the way, even though I don't have an ankle bracelet, they still won't give me my passport back. I cannot travel internationally. That's kind of another facet to this
Yeah.
incredible story. And it's totally uncool and unfair. So I'm having my right to travel denied. So that's why we still have this website, freedonziger.com. I can't go meet my clients in Ecuador, et cetera. And then in terms of the Greenpeace trial work, we have a website called trialmonitors.org where you can learn about that aspect of my work. You can get information about this, this slap attack against Greenpeace. and what you can do to help. Again, it's trialmonitors.org.
Fantastic. Stephen, thank you so much for being with us. We're going to collaborate more soon, and I'm grateful for your courage and your conviction.
Thank you, my friend. We'll talk soon.
Thank you all for tuning in. This is the Qasim Rashid Show here on Sirius XM Urban View Channel 126, the most awesome show in the multiverse. We'll be right back. We'll be back next week with another fantastic show, so be sure to hit that subscribe button, especially if you're listening on Substack. My friends, thank you for tuning in. Continue to look out for one another. Thank you for all the prayers and love that you've given me regarding my father. I'll see you guys next week.